Geochemistry Laboratory Network. Thank you very much for everyone's time and attention today. This is a rather unique opportunity to communicate to you the results of a project which AuScope supported, which was to capture before samples got sent to a bin, capture samples and data from the research collection of Professor Neil McNaughton. So before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk people, the traditional custodians of the land on which Curtin University and where I am located today. And I pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. If I could have the next slide, please. So just for some of you who may not be fully aware of what AuScope is a consortium of universities and government agencies that receive funding from the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure System, which is a federal government funding agency. And they fund research infrastructure. And the purpose of AuScope is to create wide and open access to earth science research infrastructure that drives world-leading Australian scientific research and helps to solve national challenges and build a resilient and sustainable nation. So in terms of research infrastructure, we have, of course, the equipment that generates data. We have services such as delivery of data, platforms, portals, and the delivery of modeling software and programs which allow geoscientists to do analytics. I would submit that there's another type of research infrastructure that the community has, and that is the samples that we use, and the fact that these samples can be shared and are shared in many of the geological surveys across the country through core libraries or rock libraries. And I would submit that the universities are also a valuable resource for samples and research collections. I think that it's also fair to say that in the past, we probably haven't done a very good job of archiving these collections properly for the benefit of the community. So if I can go on to the next project, please. The next slide, please. This project is actually an attempt to change that paradigm. We wanted to look at the collection of Professor Neil McNaughton, and which he generated over 25 years of operation in the shrimp facility at Curtin University. Neil and his students, both at UWA and Curtin, collected a globally significant collection of materials, many from deposits which are now inaccessible or where the materials have been mined out. For example, in the image on the left-hand side, you can see an open cut where the samples are no longer available from that location. So the project was to secure, digitize, and make publicly available the physical and associated metadata and data records from Neil's research career. A lot of this was published in the form of either a PhD theses or in academic publications. But you'll find that many people don't tend to publish or don't tend to cite papers which tend to be 10 or 15 years old. And so this was an opportunity for us to capture that entire 25 years of work and put it in one place. And so I think that what I hope to, what the team hopes to be able to do today is to convince you that there can be a standard approach to preserving other collections around the country as research infrastructure for the community. Could I have the next slide, please? So this talk today will include three key people. The first one will be Neil McNaughton. The second one will be Eleanor Belluro. Eleanor is the project leader who did most of the work, physical work and mental work of putting the collection together. And then Fabian Coleman of Lithodat will provide some information on how the data was uploaded into the AusGeochem data platform, which is currently in development and will soon to be released. So yeah, Neil McNaughton, for many of you who are economic geologists and know about economic geology, you'll know his work well. He is also, a renowned shrimp geochronologist and isotope geochemist. Where he worked for the last over 25 years, 35 years is recorded there. But just because he's a humble man, I'll let you know that in his career, he generated over 225 research publications. He graduated 24 PhD students and has an H index of 54. So his contribution to the research community is well known. But what is less well known are the large collection of samples that he retained and donated to the community upon his retirement in 2019. And so this project will discuss some of the aspects around that donation. And so I'd open up the floor to Neil to basically talk a little bit about his career and about the reason for donating his samples. So over to you, Neil.
Okay, thanks, Brent. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, I guess the collection we're talking about today really started about 33 years ago when the group that I was with at UWA received federal funding for a key centre. That was the key centre for strategic mineral deposits. And my role in that was essentially on the isotopic side, take the opportunities for the large increase in staff and students which that centre attracted, but both in stable and radiogenic isotopes. And at that time, we had our own preparation labs, but we didn't have the mass spectrometry infrastructure. So I developed a very close working relationship with John DeLader and Kevin Rossman at Curtin, using their TIMS facility, and we're mostly doing lead isotope work at that time. And of course, subsequent to that, John DeLader headed the very successful effort to establish a SHRIMP at Curtin. And it's really from that time that the collection began. And that we made our first SHRIMP out in 1994. And because we had our own prep labs, basically all the SHRIMP mounts which were made came through that lab, and we had an opportunity to record them and what samples were on them and so forth. And we also tried hard to recover them. PhD students and staff came and went and so forth. So the aim was to try and keep hold of everything and as much information as we could. And of course, there was a lot of published information in scientific papers and in theses and in reports, AMIRA reports, non-published reports. So we did have a reasonable amount of background information, as well as holding most of the mounts. And of course, on every shrimp mount, there's a grain, and you want to know where it was analysed and so forth. So we kept that as metadata information, and that really is what has accumulated since 1994 and represents the legacy collection. Now, as Brent mentioned, because our main focus was ore deposits are mined out, or particular levels are no longer accessible for safety reasons, or simply mines are shut because they're uneconomic. So a lot of the locations where a good proportion of this materials come from are no longer accessible, and as such, the samples we have are fairly unique, and I put it akin to, say, a fossil type specimen or a rare meteorite. You just can't go out and get another one. So what was in the collection in some cases were quite unique. Now, because it was based around the shrimp, we were essentially looking at datable minerals, and obvious one of zircon, but we're also looking at things like titanite, rutile, phosphates, xenotime, monazite, etc. Now, from an exploration point of view, some of these minerals retain the chemistry which was unique to the ore environment, and as such, they might be considered like an indicator mineral, such as used in the diamond industry. So not only were we going to get data, get age data from shrimp on these minerals, but there's also the chemistry side of it. And what we've found is that materials which we've dated some time ago, people are going back and looking at that same material for the chemistry. Now, what Eleanor and her group have done in basically taking what was a collection which was on my bookshelf and scattered far and wide as far as materials are concerned, Eleanor and her group have got all that together and hopefully put it into a database which is both searchable and you can find the information on the sample. As I say, a lot of this is in a published form one way or another, and it can be available to be borrowed for further research. And bear in mind that over the last 25 or so years, new analytical techniques have come up, and there's a lot more that you can do with that sample than just what we initially were trying to do. It was just do straight geochronology. So really that's the background and I guess the context of why there is a collection. And it's not all there. There are bits and pieces missing. People have borrowed stuff and not returned it. And we weren't a library as such, keeping track of everything. So there are some people out there which might have samples who perhaps listening to this webinar who might feel a bit guilty and return stuff. But anyway, I think that's the background of all libraries and museums and similar, where you lend stuff out and you may not see it again. But we hope this is not going to be the case here. So anyway, Brent, that's about the background.
Thank you, Neil. And on behalf of the community, we thank you for donating your samples. So now we'll move on to the next part of the presentation. And so could I have the next slide, please? So Eleanor Bolero is the project scientist responsible for this activity. And I'll hand over to her for sort of a self-introduction.
Thanks, Brent. So as Brent said, I was involved in pretty much across the entire project. I was principally the person who did the metadata capture for the project, as well as managing other aspects and creating workflows and getting a sense of how we're actually going to handle this project. But currently, I split my time between the John Delata Centre at Curtin, as well as the Geological Survey of Western Australia. I have a number of roles. My work on this legacy collection of Neil's is sort of taking me into the work I'm doing this year at GSWA, where I'm involved using another large data set. So large data sets are something that I like to work on, and it's certainly given me a lot of experience from working on this collection. So there's no denying, based on what Brent and Neil have already said, that this collection is particularly huge. We had over 1,000 mounts and even more physical samples. These are the mounts from the McNaughton collection shown here, and they're from all over the world. But before this project happened, we had everything physically. We had physical mounts, we had physical research materials. It was not readily accessible, and there was no digital footprint of any kind, which in this digital age means that it's not really a known factor. It's almost an unknown. No one knows it was around or available. There was also no template or a unified way of creating such a legacy catalogue. But I can say after this project that preserving legacy collections is certainly not an insurmountable task. Now, before I give an overview of the project, I just want to acknowledge all the people involved in the project. While I certainly had a lot to do, I wasn't the only one We had parties involved from the library at Curtin who were instrumental in helping us get everything ready to go online, as well as creating all sorts of metadata that we required and sourcing information for me. We had parties from the Jungle Data Center. We had Neil directly involved, which was a great asset. We had a GSWA representative in Dr. Michael Mingate. And first and foremost, I really need to thank all of the students that were involved in the digitization team. Without them, I probably would have only been able to collect half of the data that we actually got in the end. So without them, the project would not be as it is. So once again, guys, thank you very much. So by creating a template, we hoped that we could preserve this collection that was so important, but also facilitate the preservation of similar collections. By collecting and capturing the metadata, we could make all of these mounts discoverable for future research and achieve the most visibility by contributing this metadata to a variety of online portals. All of the detailed template and project specifics are going to be given and available within an upcoming GSWA record, as well as an associated publication. But I will also be happy to answer any additional questions at the end. But this is pretty much going to be an overview of the project. I would just like to say that when it comes to legacy collections, all does not have to be lost. But there is certainly a huge benefit in doing things sooner rather than later. I'm now going to go through sort of a walkthrough of the key stages of the project, going step by step of the key sort of aspects that future legacy collections should think about and should undertake. So as Neil said, when we started, we literally had a collection of notebooks that he had been building over the years. This is an example of one of the pages from his notebooks. We were pretty lucky to have this information. We had essentially a record of every mount that was created in every year, including the ID number of the mount, the names of the people involved, and the associated sample identification numbers within those mounts. However, there was no lithological information, and there was also no location information recorded for any of these samples, unless you could determine that from the actual sample name itself. So that meant that essentially the minimum metadata that you required to really locate and use a geological sample had to be acquired completely secondarily, essentially by myself. So we need to really motivate people in the future, as well as right now, to start collecting this information as they go, as well as before they retire, just so that it's a little bit easier to kind of move forward and create these collections. So as a starting point, we needed to decide what type of metadata do we actually want to preserve, what's available, what's going to be useful. At the end of the day, we decided that if we were able to, we should try and preserve as much information as possible, and then we could provide that information to all the different portals that we decided to publish the data on as they required it. In the end, we actually had 51 different columns of metadata that could have been provided for a single sample. And we decided to create the catalog in Excel as it was easily accessible and known to all of the project participants and was user-friendly. So to collect the additional information that we did not have from Neil's notebooks, essentially I had to go through PhD theses, find associated journal articles, as well as go through any sort of resource-related reports. Now, we actually ended up purchasing copies of the theses from WA to improve the accessibility to this data, and hopefully they may become sourceable through the library at Curtin as well. Any journal articles that I couldn't find were also sourced by the Curtin Library, and Neil was able to provide me with most of the sort of unpublished Amira and Merriwell reports. One thing that I did notice in the collection in particular is that sometimes the time gap between data collection and data publication was as large as 20 years, which is almost the size of the collection itself. So that meant that there was going to be a proportion of information that was not going to be readily available to me in the immediate lifetime of this project. And I feel that that is probably going to be an issue for every legacy collection. But there is still a lot of information that could be found by trying to associate published media with the original records of your samples. So in addition to all of the mounts and all of the metadata that we had to find and locate in order to utilize the samples in the future, we also had about 75% of mounts having an associated box of physical research materials. So at the bottom, we have an example of approximately half of the research materials that were available inside these boxes. The cupboards are all full as well. We had to utilize any space that we had available. And essentially these boxes contain things like photographs, like old photo paper photographs, scanning electron microscope images, analytical sheets of analysis sessions, and also storage mediums such as floppy disks and CD-ROMs. Now, this looks like a lot of material, and it certainly was, but this task was actually one of the most important tasks of the project, as some metadata was found in these materials that was not available elsewhere. And some samples wouldn't have been able to be utilized in the future if we hadn't actually taken the time to go through this information. So if you have these kind of materials, I highly recommend that you actually do take the time to preserve them. To preserve them, I instigated a two-step process, which allowed 2 team members to be working at the same time and both producing information. Essentially, we would catalog the contents of these boxes, and then we would later digitize them. So we would have a record of what materials were available, and then also create digital counterparts of them. To show you some pictures of the kinds of things that we found in the boxes, this is one of my digitizing assistants, Shireen, sorting the boxes by year. We try to keep everything really organized, as it's very easy with the volume of materials to get lost in terms of what's been preserved and what hasn't. Inside the boxes, we would have images of mounts. Usually they were sort of collages of analog photographs. And then those mounts would also have individual, more zoomed in photos to actually get a closer look at the samples. We also would find printouts or copies of different kinds of imaging, log sheets, emails, random reports, also a few random objects. People like to preserve gloves, apparently, as well as until 2005, analog photography was very prevalent. So we definitely were up to our ears in photo negatives, as you can see here. This is approximately 1 PhD's worth of photo negatives. And as I said, you know, this was a time-consuming process, but it was incredibly worthwhile, and preserved all of these physical materials to essentially streamline and allow future research to sort of proceed relatively quickly if need be. Some documents were not scanned due to the sheer volume of them and the time constraints, as well as their limited use, but they are still stored at the University of Western Australia. So when we sort of finished digitizing parts of the collection, usually about half of the materials, we would essentially have to take them back to the UWA storage facility, which is shown here in the middle, and essentially reorganize them, swap them over, and take the rest of the materials back to digitize those. And eventually everything was returned to the UWA storage facility. These are essentially stacked too deep. So you can see that there is a huge amount of material that were digitized. And at the end of the project, myself and my team members had digitized and created over 31,000 files, which amounted to about 141 gigabytes. So a significant portion of digitized files now exist and are accessible via the collection. So before I go any further, for those of you that don't know, an International Geosample Number, or IGSN, is a unique geological sample number. So for example, in the year 2016, many researchers might have gone in the field and collected a sample 1, a sample 2, and then when they go to publish that paper, it can be very confusing and difficult to connect a published paper or data to a very specific rock sample. So that's where an IGSN comes in. An IGSN is an alphanumeric identification number that is completely unique worldwide. There will never be 2 IGSNs given to, or 2 of the same IGSNs given to different samples. So essentially, you get a unique number with associated metadata and a correlated web page for that metadata with a link that cannot be broken. So this is a great way to allow the connection of physical samples to digital metadata without any confusion. So once we had the metadata as well as the digital materials, we decided to create IGSNs for samples that had enough metadata, essentially a location and a rock type. We had the question of what level do we mint our IGSNs? And we decided, due to the complexity of the collection, that we would mint an IGSN for the whole mount itself, but also for the individual samples inside those mounts. So for example, we have this sample here in this mount with its own IGSN, and the mount itself has an associated IGSN. So these IGSNs were minted using the Australian Research Data Commons API service as opposed to their web interface, just because this allowed us to mint a high volume of IGSNs with a lot more simplicity than having to do it as an iterative process. As a part of creating these IGSNs, we also created what's called a handle link. Now, this form of URL is really important as it's quite short, allowing it to be quite easily used, but also it's essentially unbreakable. So anything that is connected using that URL, so you might use it to link files or things on a server, essentially if you move those files, this link will still work, meaning that your collection is future-proofed and you don't suddenly have all these broken links if you decide to relocate your files or associated media. So if we have a look at this link here, this is an example of the handle link for that same sample. And if you were to use that link, it essentially takes you to this loading page associated with the IGSN and metadata. It links you to the collection catalog, but it also allows you to access all of the digital media associated with that mount. So this is a really neat way of digitally connecting all of the different parts from your legacy collection. I've also included on this slide the link to the Curtin server collection for the McNaughton collection, as well as the header page for the collection on Research Data Australia, if you want to get a look at what's currently available. So once we had our IGSNs and our links, it was time to prepare the mounts for future storage and use. So based on some advice from the Curtin Archival experts, we decided to continue to store the mounts within these 3.7 centimeter acrylic cases, but we also decided to create archival quality labels so that they would be readily identifiable. So these labels include the original mount identification number, but also a QR code that uses the handle link to essentially, you can scan it and find the metadata that goes with the sample. It's very handy if you happen to have a lot of samples and need to know which is which. So these links and these codes were created by Brendan, shown here, who is dutifully applying them by hand. And it's certainly a great way of utilizing the metadata to its fullest. So once we had all our IGSNs and all of our handle links and all of the metadata, it was then necessary to start putting things online and making everything discoverable. So firstly, all of the digital media and all of the files that we created were first moved from Curtin's internal storage servers to the publicly available servers. So these would then be accessible to anyone that had the required links. And also the web pages that were created with the IGSNs that I showed before were then activated and publicly available. And then once the metadata had been checked and refined, we essentially distributed it to 3 different online platforms, including GeoView associated with GSWA, AusGeochem with AuScope, and Research Data Australia. I would like to make a few recommendations for future projects. I highly recommend that people start creating sample catalogs as soon as possible with the minimum metadata. If you have a collection, please do this. I'm already doing it myself. It certainly helps this kind of process down the line and makes it a lot less tedious than trying to do it later. I would also recommend that you use sample identification numbers that are consistent across catalogs and publications, just to allow the connection between your physical samples and your published media. But also the implementation of IGSNs is a great way to make this a very streamlined process. And I highly recommend that these are used as well as increased in publications. It is possible to create a legacy catalog such as this with relatively low infrastructure, but I highly recommend that you have team members that are specialized in the area associated with the collection. So in our case, we had team members that had a background in geoscience, and that certainly helped in making this project happen. But it's also incredibly helpful and extremely valuable to have the associated researcher on board, just as we had in Neil. And that the physical research materials, like all of the photos and mount images that we had, those are an incredibly important source of metadata and certainly should be preserved, even though it takes a lot of effort to do that. Also, just a little preservation suggestion. If you have physical records that contain storage media, such as floppies and CDs, a controlled environment is certainly preferable. About 99% of floppy disks and about 80% of CD drives were corrupted just from how they were stored, and that could have been an additional source of information to us. Also, the use of photo paper was incredibly prevalent in in the days of this project. So avoiding folding that material as well as using lucky bands that don't last too well is certainly advisable. And making sure that all the samples in your collection have durable forms of labeling, just so that when someone else comes along, you can still tell what is what. A few of the achievements: we saved over 1,000 physically irreplaceable sample mounts. We also happened to locate over 4,000 samples by finding the metadata. So those were samples that we can now see on a map. 98% of samples from Western Australia were given IGSNs, and we actually had many interested parties in the collection before it was even completed. So I think these things just show, one, how much can be done and how much value there really is in doing this kind of work. I can now say, as of a few weeks ago, all of the sample mounts have been relocated to the GSWA Carlisle storage facility, and as I mentioned earlier, there will be a GSWA record and journal article with more details to come. I can also say that if you wish to borrow mounts, please reach out to the geochronology department at DNIRS. They will be handling the loaning of these materials. And I can also say in the coming weeks, the McNaughton collection will be available as a new layer within GeoView, such as we can see here. Under the geochronology tab. This is not publicly available yet, but in a couple of weeks it will be, and you'll be able to see all of the WA samples and click and see the metadata associated with them, as well as links to all of the digital files here. The whole collection itself will also be available on AusGeochem in the near future, and it's currently in development by AGN and Lithodat. Fabian from Lithodat is going to talk to us next about some developments in that area. Let's hand over to Fabian.
Okay, thanks, Eleanor. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Okay. Yeah, let me quickly briefly introduce myself. My name is Fabian Coleman. I'm the managing director of Lithodat. We are a data provider and platform developer of cloud-hosted spatial geoscience datasets. And we are currently helping the AGN team building the AusGeochem platform as a hub for all Australian geochemistry labs to connect, store, and share their data. So today I will talk a bit about the McNaughton data on the early stage of the AusGeochem platform. The AusGeochem platform goals are to connect all the member institutes and labs of the Australian geochemistry network digitally. And each AGN member should be then able to log into the AusGeochem platform and execute the following tasks. So the main thing is they can contribute data, they can enter data via forms, you can upload data directly from hooked up machines. You can review the data, meaning all the data can be QA/QC'd. Each lab has an internal review process. We have a lot of automated quality controls set up as well. And the nice thing is they can manage the data. So you can, besides the reviewing, you can also access the data. You can delete data. You can hold data back. For example, if it's not published yet and you don't want to share it, you can view it already and use it, but you have full access rights to that data. And all the data can then be also streamed to WMS, other portals. And you can utilize the data on that platform. They can search the data, filter the data, do spatial analytics on the fly, and download selected data, which I will show you soon. So as I mentioned before, the main thing is linking up all the Australian labs producing different isotopic geochemistry data and bringing them together in one platform to access the data, to store them, and then to share it with each other. But beside all the data they currently produce, it also enables them to store legacy data collections. For example, the McNaughton data collection can be brought in the same data platform and then shared with the wider research community. To highlight a bit the difference between a portal architecture and the platform architecture, what we are developing here is there are some portals already out there, like the USGS portal you can see here, or the AuScope Discovery portal, or the new Geoscience Australia portal. Those portals are really awesome places to go and find data. So they have a lot of different data types and data sets on there, and makes it available for the users to use. So it's very nice to access it, but this data is coming from a lot of different feeds. So in each feed has their own data structure. So these data types can't communicate with each other. So it's very hard to you can run analytics maybe in one data set, but not across platform. So that's a nice thing, having it in a platform setting, where we have a big relational database in which we store all the different kinds of data coming in, and they're all standardized. So that means you suddenly have the options to interact with all kind of dispersed data in one place, and you can do these live cross data analytics. And nevertheless, all of these data, you can still feed them then back as an WMS, WFS feed to those portals as well to make them even more discoverable. So let's show a bit how we deal with the McNaughton data, our current phase. As you can see, that's another advantage. A lot of these portals actually just focus at the moment on a national scale, but the McNaughton dataset is a big, huge data set which contains a lot of international, global data points. And in that portal, we are able to, in our platform, we are able to show them these global points. And the McNaughton datasets have over 4,000 points all across the world. But let's focus a bit on the Australian McNaughton uranium lead ages. So as you can see, that's the first views we have on our platform developed. So the nice thing is you can then query the data. For example, you can click on each data point and you get all the meta information. For example, what elevation it was taken on, what latitude, longitude, the ages, the type, and you have a lot of interactivity. For example, you see the reference, you can click on the reference, and it automatically opens in a new tab then the actual paper, the publication. You can go in there, you can download it. But also another very nice function is, as Eleanor showed before, that data set, the McNaughton data set, they have a handle link. And through that link, you can access then all the extra information for each sample. Like you can get all the scans of the actual mounts and the analysis. So you can access it all through that one platform. And also the interactivity is that you can do a multi-selection. Like you select more grains here. Let's say we select the whole WA McNaughton uranium lead data, and it creates a age histogram on the fly. You can change the bin sizes on the fly as well if you want to. We can activate filters, for example, by age, where you can then highlight or see better where you have your old ages sitting, or the distribution of your old and young ages. And then all the data you selected, you can of course open it in a data table view, and you can see on the left, for example, are then all the publications and references for each data point you selected. The underscored ones are the ones which have a hyperlink, so you click on them, it opens in the tab. That means those ones have a DOI. The other ones which are not underlined, for example, they could be PhD theses or master theses, which don't have a DOI. Nevertheless, you click on them, you get all the information, which university, where they are, how many pages. So you can find each data point in there. All the columns you see, you can rearrange, you can click on top, you can sort them, you have full interactivity, you can click on show more data, so it opens all the metadata which is provided and stored in different tables. And you can then download the data in whatever format you want to, from CSV to Excel, KMZ, GeoJSON, you name it. Let's focus a bit on the northwestern part of WA. We see some data points here also from the McNaughton collection using our satellite views with road as background. But we also have a nice base map implemented now, which contains all geological maps of Australia summarized, so you can see where the samples have been taken. You can then click on each geological unit and you get all the information of the name, the formation name, the age. So you get much more information extra around your sample locations. And the other nice thing is, additionally to, we have now the McNaughton data in there, but as I said, you can turn on and integrate it with all the other data coming in from the other labs in Australia. So that's just the uranium lead data we have currently in there. And as I said, it's just early stages, so there will be much more data coming in future. We can add a lot of different systems, like here, see Victoria and New South Wales, where we have some samarium, lithium, hafnium, rhenium, osmium, rubidium, strontium, argon, potassium, argon, and you can filter it by either age. You have all the information on the side. You have the full interactivity. The nice thing is we can combine it then. For example, that's now adding the geochronology data, mainly appetite fission track data, provided from the Melbourne University laboratory from Professor Andy Glado and Barry Cohn. And the nice thing then, as I said, because there are still different isotopes, but isotopic systems, but we have them now in one database, so we can do query across different databases. So if we do a multi-select and we want to select the uranium lead together with the fission track data, we can create graphs on the fly containing different data types at once, as you can see in that age elevation plot, for example. And then we're having dashboards, so we give the opportunity, you can see actually the data you selected, but then also a whole range of graphs which you have in there, and you can even interact with the graphs. As I said, you can change the bars, you can change the axis, you can even change the actual plot you're looking at. If you want a different plot, you can then change to a different one and then adjust the dashboard to your needs. So that's what we're currently at a stage of developing. So we're planning to release it by end of this year. It will be the first pass of the AusGeochem platform being available to the wider public. Other stuff we are working on, we want to integrate is, for example, the full isoplot-R functionality, because let's say we hook up the machines directly, the raw data comes in. But then if people want to work with the data, what they have to do to the data reduction, they have to download it, put it either in using iolite or glitter, and then upload it back again. So the nice thing is if we integrate the functionality, for example, we can use plugins which we can develop together with users of, let's say, iolite or glitter, and then they can do it on the fly, and the data is coming straight back into the database. So you don't have to separate. You have all your workflows in one place. And other things we're working on, as I said, there will be many more systems coming now in the near future, and a lot of details of metadata, such as details what the funding bodies were for each study, the grant numbers, who was the chief investigator, the mount numbers, and much more. Also, we want to do integrated automated IGSN minting options. So, for example, if you upload some samples and you don't have yet an IGSN number, we're running an API which will give it automatically assign a number to it. We also offer then an open REST API, so users can develop their own analytic tools, hook up more machines if they want to, create software plugins, numeric modeling feeds, machine learning applications, and that's all open source. that thing which will plug in straight into the AusGeochem platform. And further down the line, ideally, we want to have a data repository. As Australia, we don't have a repository where we can store geoscientific data, and you get an automatic DOI for your published data, like a publishing option for data. There are few in America and in Europe available, but we are planning, hopefully we can get the AusGeochem platform to have the same functionality in future. And as I showed before, the integrated cloud data reduction functionality would be really nice to have that all in one place. So yeah, if you want to learn more, feel free to drop us a line, and otherwise, yeah, thanks for your attention. And I'm handing back to Brent McGuinness. Thanks.
Thanks, Fabian. Well, in summary, I hope you learned a little bit about what we, in terms of preserving the McNaughton Legacy Collection. It was a unique opportunity, a unique collection. We thank Neil for donating his collection to science, and it was a really a good learning opportunity for all the community involved, and we hope that it catches on across the sector. We have 1,000 shrimp mounts, which are now available for research from places that you probably can't get back to. So that's a invaluable and opportunity for us to make a difference. So thank you to Eleanor for creating, with your team, creating a bespoke solution to make that sample data and metadata fair and accessible, and using persistent identifiers and multiple discovery platforms. The physical samples are available at the GSWA, and so that's an opportunity for further research. And we look forward to publishing this information. Eleanor will be in charge of that, and it'll be great to see that come out and for that to be passed on to future generations. So with that, we'll open up to questions. I think there's a couple of questions in the chat box. I think I'll just read those while people think about what other questions they might like to have. There's one from Andy Gledo. Did you have a quality control procedure to ensure that samples were not mislabeled during the archiving process?
Hi, Eddie, and thank you for that. So it was kind of a multi-step process. I mean, as we had Neil's records, we knew exactly how many mounts there were supposed to be in each year. And as he said, you know, things had been borrowed. So it was necessary very early on to take stock of what we had, as well as to include the availability of those particular mounts right now within the metadata of the collection. So early on, essentially, I took stock of what mounts were available and what mounts were essentially on holiday with a researcher somewhere. Essentially saying, do we have them right now? Do we not have them right now? So that meant checking each mount to make sure that the sample container matched with the sample itself, and trying to make sure that that was all consistent. And then as we were collecting metadata as well as creating labels, we were constantly referring back to and double checking that, yes, okay, we have said that this mount is here. Yes, we have the information for it. Yes, it's okay to create a label and or IGSN for that. So this was abreast of myself as well as the digitization team, that we were constantly sort of checking what was actually in the box and then what was actually being written down and recorded as being correct. And of course, it is a difficult task to keep so many samples straight. But between multiple levels of quality control checks along the way, pretty sure that everything should be correct in that aspect. But if anyone has any really detailed questions, I'm happy to answer via email as well.
Thanks, Eleanor. Leslie Wyborn asked you if you were wondering if you would submit a publication to the International Data Science Journal. Have you looked at the journals out there and where you might submit the publication?
There was. So we are looking at, I think it's the Australian Journal of Earth Science as a potential potential place to publish, as well as maybe the International Journal of Digital Curation might be an option, but that also does sound like a potential option for us as well. Thank you for suggesting that.
Now we'll open up the floor to questions from anyone.
Hi, Eleanor. Sam Boone here from the AGN and Melbourne Uni. Really nice talk and excellent work. I'm sure that was a huge undertaking to catalog and organize all of those things. I've got a quick question about whether you're also archiving where those physical specimens lie, as far as have you built a database where someone could refer to it and then basically go and know exactly which shelf and where on the shelf that you could find those samples? And if so, how did you go about doing that? What did you use to build that database?
So when the samples were here, it was very internal, mostly like keeping a list of everything that was present. All of the actual mounts now are located at the GSW storage facility, and they're going to be put into essentially a storage container of some kind and preserved properly. I mean, they have a huge collection of systems and all sorts of things like that as well, so they're well equipped to preserve this as an archival collection. And all of the samples are essentially going to go into their internal sample database, and essentially to find actually a sample or figure out what sample you want to borrow, like which mount it is in, you can use the legacy catalog, which is available through the Curtin server or any of the IGSN links. So that's a searchable spreadsheet that has all of the sample numbers, the mount numbers, as well as, let's say you've looked for a sample, you can essentially find out which one you're interested, like which mount you're interested in, to then contact the survey through all the different portals that we're putting all of our metadata on. But in terms of how everything is stored in one place for the entire collection, regardless of where that sample is actually originally from. They're all with GSWA.
Okay, thanks.
There's a question here from someone. Do you have a process for checking whether a sample already has an IGSN before you assign it a new one?
That is a really good question. We didn't really require a check for that because everything that we found metadata for was essentially relatively published before IGSNs were used, or when we found the metadata, there was no IGSN associated with anything. So we didn't have to really worry about duplicating an IGSN for any of the materials. But that is certainly something that would be potentially more of an issue in the future. But the main, I guess, way of checking that is through publications. But again, that lead time in data collection and publication is also a potential issue in that. But for us, it wasn't really a problem.
I think the other distinction to make is that you issued an IGSN for the sample mount rather than the initial raw sample. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. As well as technically, IGSN was for essentially the material in the mount, if you want to get very technical about it. So, if there is also an IGSN of the rock sample that the mineral separate came from, I think the way we did it kind of circumvents any sort of real duplication in a way.
Yeah. Can people hear me? It's Jeff Fraser here. Can people hear me? Hello?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure if my mute button was working. Yeah, that was my question, Eleanor. But yeah, I just wanted to say that I think it was fantastic presentation, and also just fantastic body of work. There's a lot we can all learn from that. It's really good. But yeah, I do think that issue of possibly ending up with multiple IGSN numbers is something we need to be careful of in the future, as something we will have to grapple with here at Geoscience Australia, because we are dealing with samples that may have come from a state survey, for example, and then come to us, and they may have already assigned an IGSN number, but it's, you know, there's the possibility for that not to be clearly communicated, and then we assign another one, and then you end up with the same confusion that we're trying to avoid, that, you know, samples have multiple numbers and it's hard to connect what you're talking about. So it's not maybe not have been a problem in this project, but something we'll have to think about for the future.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, sorry?
I was just going to say, Leslie here, in AuScope, we're actually trying to work with the Australian IGSN community to develop a way of portraying the samples map. So at least if you know the location, you can keep blowing it up and see whether that sample, it spatially could have an IGSN. At the moment, we can't do it because people have been using IGSNs in Australia to the extent there's now something like 3 million, and the mapping technology falls over, but we're developing a new architecture that will be enabling that to happen. There's another project ARDC is funding called FAMES, which is Field Acquired Information Management System, and that will be doing something like what CSIRO has already done, so that when you go out into the field, if you take one of these loggers that'll fit on an Android or an iPhone, you can assign the IGSN in the field and automatically get the GPS location, etc., and then upload it to a database, which is another thing. We've got another AODC project, there's too many going on in this, that is going to try and help that happen. So the researcher, we call it a dirt to desktop system. You go out in the field, you collect the sample, and so for geochronology, you collect the rock, then as you do the mineral separates, that's a parent-child, and then as you do the grain mounts, and you see how you can just chain all these IGSNs and be able to credit the grain mount back to the poor old person that actually went out in the field and dug the hole and got the sample. There's a lot going on at the moment to try and tie all this together and what we call reduce the time to science for the average geochemist.
Thanks, Leslie. Okay, so look, everyone, I think that'll be a wrap. It's coming on to the hour. Really like to thank everyone for attending the webinar today and for the participants in delivering the excellent presentation. We're going to do this once a month. We don't know what we're going to talk about next, so if you got any ideas, if you want to give a presentation as part of this webinar series, reach out by all means. So anyway, have a good day, and we look forward to talking to you next month. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.